You're what? What's that? No, I'm just I did not get emails from any of them. Remember, snitches get stitches. What's that? By whom? Yeah. Okay. All right. No. Yep, sign those. Because I left my folder that has all of my usual things in it on my desk at work and grabbed a different folder because they're all beige. Yep. Yep. Over there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Where's everybody at? That's fair. All right, it is 6 o'clock. We're gonna get started. I'm not gonna tell you anything about your classmates. Well, then ask him. Duh. If he's your friend, you should know. You should be telling us for kids. Yeah, where is it? First matter of business. So folks that are doing their project on the 3, okay, so first of all, who has actually met with their group members and started working yet? Wow, you guys are like high achievers. Good for you. How many of you are lying? Huh, okay, cool. Well, bad news bears, who's in the 3 strikes rule group? Okay, one of your classmates is gonna be out. And so you have an option, either somebody from capital punishment or psych profiling can volunteer to join that group instead, or you guys can find a more creative way to fill up your 20 minutes. We can think about this. What's that? Oh yeah, you don't have to answer right now, but let me know after break maybe. To join the 3 strikes rule group instead. If like, so I was asking if people have started yet, because if you've already started, obviously that would be a pain in the ass. And if you haven't, then if somebody would be willing to volunteer from either the capital punishment group, because that has 5, yeah? No. Oh. It just reminded me, so you said the 20 minutes thing. Yeah. Yeah, and that can include discussion questions. And if it doesn't take the whole 20 minutes, it's not the end of the world, right? So, but you can get, you know, you can throw in some videos, you can, as long as everybody is even in some way, or let's say you do have 5 people and one person hates talking and maybe that person contributes by writing the entire PowerPoint or whatever, or something, that's also fair as long as you tell me that for your grade. You and then. Couple questions. Okay. Okay. And if you're going to include like how many sources are necessary, and along those slides, because I try to look on the syllabus and I look at other specifics. So if I miss something, no, you're fine. I thought I made a rubric, but it looks like I didn't post it, so I will post that. Should probably put that on there for you. Where did it go? I did, and that should also be there. Did I put it in this? Did I put it in the wrong spot? Because that's possible. It's somewhere. I'll get it up there. There is one, but I will get it up there. Well, If you go over to the point where it detracts from other people's groups, yes. I'm not going to sit here with a stopwatch. That's weird. Why? Was it like an actual stopwatch? I have a pocket watch. I could bring that. Just, pull it out all sophisticated like. Yeah, I'm not going to sit here with a stopwatch. I'll be looking at that clock. And if it's like under by a minute or two, that's okay. If it's over by a minute, because there's the thing, some people speak more quickly, some people talk really slowly, all that kind of stuff. I think yeah, think about 4 to 5 minutes per person. And do not, I think I mentioned this before, if 10 minutes of your 20 is videos or things like that, then you're probably going to lose points for that because it's, it can be like a few minutes, but it shouldn't be the majority of your presentation. All right, let's talk about juvie. Did someone say their favorite? Juvie's their favorite? Okay, all right. Okay, you're fine. So some people really like juvie based on like your experience there, or what's that? From juvie? Well, their little holding cell that they had I was so confused. It's fine. Okay, so everybody be real quiet, make it real awkward. That was super awkward. Okay, cool. So first, vocabulary. Status offense, basically a generic term that we use to refer to any crime that is committed by a juvenile that would not be considered a crime if they were an adult. For example, truancy. Obviously, you're all grown-ups. I'm not going to send police to your house if you miss class. If it happens enough and you are a juvenile, that could be a charge. Purchasing alcohol, under 21, over 21, curfew violations, things like that. Anybody think of any other examples? Mm-hmm. What's that? Absolutely. Running away from home could be a charge. Mm-hmm. What happens if you run away after 18? Nothing. Okay. You wait 24 hours and you call in a missing persons report and hope that they're not dead. What if they are going away and the parent knows? You mean like they move out? Sure. That's something else. That's not anything. That's just. You're talking about like running away, like not like. Well, even if you do tell someone, if you're a juvenile, you could still be picked up for it. And that's a problematic thing because kids run away for a reason, right? And so when we pick them up and send them back home, potentially into the same situation that they were trying to escape, that's an issue. But yeah, you can get, especially if it's repeated running away, you can get charged with that if you are under 18. A person in need of supervision. So this is different than adults. This is where we start looking at things like repeated running away or truancy, etc. You can be placed under supervision because there are concerns. As opposed to if you're an adult, we can't just be like, I don't trust that guy. We're going to get him a PO, right? Parens patriae is the Latin term. So basically, in the United States, the state can become the ultimate parent of the child if needed. So this refers not only to juveniles that are in trouble, that are considered delinquent, have committed some kind of crime, but also juveniles that are neglected, abused, so on and so forth. And loco parentis, which is the act in which the state will take over parental duties. Basically, the state becomes your guardian. So if you're in the foster care system, for instance, the state is your guardian. Eventually, the foster parent can become your guardian, but the state is technically your guardian, and they get to make those choices. Really? So the whole ultimate parent thing, this basically says that everyone the state can act as the parent. The second part there is when they actually step in and do so. So notice if you look at the Latin itself, what does patriae look like to you? Anybody? So the state is considered sort of the status of being one's father. What is loco? Not in Spanish. What is loco in Latin? Try again. That was excellent, though. Not wrong, not incorrect, technically correct. What is like a locomotive? What does it do? It's doing stuff, right? It's movement, right? So this is the actual act, the movement of the state stepping in to act as the parent, okay? So subtle difference. One is the status of the thing, the art of being, whatever. The other is the actual act of the state choosing to do so. So let's talk about some history. Juvenile history is interesting. So we talked a lot about adult penitentiaries. So originally, and you all know this because you've all read Davis by now. Yeah, definitely. So penitentiaries have been used to house adult offenders, people with mental illness, people with developmental disabilities, people that were perceived as being unfit for society for various reasons. And for a long time, that also included juveniles, and they were housed in adult penitentiaries. So the same is still true for children in that even if you don't commit a crime and you are considered a person in need of supervision, there are places that you can be sent by a judge, right? So like those terrifying wilderness camps, that sort of thing, treatment facilities, so on and so forth. Can also be sent to various placements for things that are not even behavioral. Let's say you've been orphaned and there's no one to take you. You are now a ward of the state and you will be sent somewhere, ideally to a safe and loving foster home. Doesn't always happen that way, right? We know that that system isn't great, but lots of things that could happen for that. So why did we start basically taking kids away from families or kids that didn't have families? This became a common theme in the 19th century during industrialization. So you have mass movement of people to cities, perceived uptick in crime. This also meant lack of resources for people, like we've talked about before. So if you come from a family and you live somewhere where maybe you are sharecroppers and your children don't go to school because they are working the fields with you, or you're in Appalachia and your children start working in the coal mines at age 13, so on and so forth, and you have to move elsewhere because it's the Dust Bowl or the Great Depression or whatever, or to go work in factories. When we started having child labor laws, but we didn't have mandated or paid for school, because keep in mind at this point in history, there is not public school. Children are just out on the street. So they're going to get picked up for things like vagrancy. If they're, from poorer families, maybe they end up pickpocketing, all sorts of reasons why there's this perceived uptick in crime amongst children. And so we create a juvenile justice system. First thing was houses of refuge. So this was supposed to be just like it sounds. It was supposed to be a place like an orphanage or another place usually run by various charities, religious organizations, that kind of thing, where minors could go and live if they had nowhere else to go. So let's say you are, your parents have died or your parents have left or whatever happens. Have you heard of orphan trains before? So not just orphans, but people would essentially, if they didn't have what they needed to take care of their children, they would just stick them on a train and send them elsewhere. And these kids ended up in the city and didn't have a lot of places to go, things to do. So the idea with the house of refuge was to prevent delinquency. Very similar to kind of early adult penitentiaries here, or not really students, but the residents, for lack of a more specific appropriate term, are essentially studying religion. They are learning certain trades. They're learning to work. They have chores assigned to them, so on and so forth. Lots of issues here, pretty much the same as we see with adult penitentiaries. There's overcrowding. There's lots of abuse. Make sure you sign in. So on and so forth. And of course, we have the Civil War, the First World War, all kinds of things happening that lead to an uptick in children not having their parents. So bazillion things going on. We've got Industrial Revolution all the way up through the First World War. Lots of reasons people lose their parents, but also lots of reasons people end up in cities and end up in these very sort of crowded institutions. What do you think it would be like to let's say you're an adult and you work at a factory and you've got to compete with, you know, a bunch of 13-year-olds for your job. What do you think that's going to end up looking like? Because we don't have child labor laws and we don't have mandated public schooling. Make sure you fit in them. No worries. Any ideas? Really?
Lots of kids getting injured.
Yeah, lots of injuries. It also led to the establishment of child labor laws. And when folks started coming back from the war, those that made it back from the war, we see like, okay, what are we going to do with these kids? So we create public schools, but a lot of families were already kind of broken up by these huge international events, plus the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression and all that. What are you doing? Do you want help? Well done. Okay. So then we create workhouses and reformatories. The idea here is that work will make them better. There is a theory, and we still see this theory, that if we give people some kind of vocation or we teach them some kind of trade, that they will automatically want to become good tax-paying citizens and productive members of society, right? We know that that's a great idea, and in theory, in practicality, it doesn't always work because, once again, these types of institutions end up being fraught with overcrowding and abuse and all sorts of other issues. It also led to what accounts to child slavery. So a workhouse, for instance, might be a garment factory, or, you know, you become a chimney sweep, or all of those kind of sort of stereotypical things that we see in the early 20th century. But essentially, we're taking children out of schools, the ones that are in schools at this point, putting them into a workhouse or reformatory with the idea, okay, well, we can teach them to be better with the, like, we're going to prevent them from becoming delinquent as adults. So finally, we decide we should actually establish a court just for juveniles. So 1899, Cook County in Illinois, home of Chicago. Lots of kids in Chicago. Chicago is one of the big landing spots for the Great Migration from the South after the Civil War, and also one of the spots that was hit most hard, both by the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, and the First World War. Lots of factories, we've got lots of kids making ammo, all that kind of thing, but we also have lots of children that are orphaned. We have lots of children that are just living on the streets, lots and lots of homelessness, all kinds of things. And instead of continuing to put them through the adult court system, which was happening up until then, Cook County said, no, we're going to create a juvenile system and we're going to treat these kids differently than we do adults, which makes a lot of sense. So the emphasis shifts then to education, particularly public education. This is the first time we have public education. This is the first time we have funded public education. Up until then, only wealthy kids are going to school. You might have, especially in more rural areas, you might have schools run by religious institutions, but most of them only go up through elementary school. So we still have pretty low literacy rates, and we have nowhere for people to go during the day. So first it becomes like a socially acceptable thing, and then after people got over the idea that this was socialist, it became mandated in most states. All of you probably are mandated to finish school in some way, and if you do not, your parents are held accountable for that. If you stop showing up to school, CPS is going to show up and knock on your door and say, where's your kid? If you are being homeschooled, your parents have specific requirements that they have to meet for the state to make sure you're actually getting an education, all that kind of stuff. Doesn't always work, but in theory, it is there.
So what kind of things do you like that? Is there like musical dropouts in there? Were there parents and which one?
Depends on what the reason is. If you actually drop out, you have to go through a process to drop out. If you just stop showing up completely and nobody talks about why and nobody answers to the school, then they will show up. And you won't sort of automatically be punished for it. It's usually like, what's going on here, right? Is the kid sick? Are they hurt? So that's one of the big ways that we find out about a lot of child abuse cases is the kids stop showing up at school and then people go knock on the door and the kid's locked up in the basement or, you know, some sort of horrific thing like that. Typically, that's one of the first ways that we really see that type of abuse or neglect happening. So the reformatories and workhouses still exist at that point, even with public school, with the same idea, right? We want to prevent people from becoming delinquent, quote unquote. The emphasis is on sobriety, thriftiness, industry, and prudence. Lots of fun words. It could be a GFU logo. Thriftiness, industry, and prudence. So sobriety, obviously not using substances. Thriftiness, learning to spend money wisely, but at the time, thriftiness also referred to a person being able to manage a household, being able to cook for oneself, mend clothing, provide for oneself, all of that sort of stuff. Industry, so being able to work, add to the means of production, as Karl Marx would put it. And prudence. What do you think prudence means? What does it mean to be prudent? You're smirking. Yeah, let's hear about prudence. Yeah. Yeah, be prudent, right? Be a good person, whatever that means. Keeping in mind that these institutions are run by private charitable organizations. So Catholic Charities, still a huge organization, provide a lot of services now, but one of their first services was working in juvenile reformatory workhouses. Lutheran Family Services, back when it was just Lutheran Services, was one of the first. Lots of Jesuit organizations, all different private religious organizations that are essentially out of charity, right? They're not getting state funding for these things. They are doing this because it's part of the, the religious doctrine. And so part of the Reformation here was very much religious. The idea that if we can teach people to value certain things, they will not end up being delinquent. So up until 1974, we did not have any sort of national law that established juvenile courts. It was all state by state until that point. So no standardization. So first in Illinois, Cook County, they really paved the way. Oregon was pretty quick after that. One of the reasons Oregon came quickly after that was because of the orphan trains and this huge sort of migration of families and quote unquote vagrant children coming from the Dust Bowl. So the idea was that there should be a special court for delinquent children, but also children that are neglected or dependent in some way on the state. Supposed to be rehabilitative rather than punitive. And we would not bar children under the age of 12 in jails. So that's just Cook County. Other states follow suit, and then all the way up until 1974, Congress passes the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. So this was a really, really big deal for two reasons. First, they took away the ability to have somebody placed in a secure facility just for a status offense. What that means. So status offenses, again, are things that would not be considered crimes if you were an adult. So truancy, curfew, all that kind of stuff. You can still be placed in a facility, but it can't be a lockdown facility unless you do something else, like bite the officer while they're trying to arrest you or, commit another crime or whatever. But the idea here was that people should not be placed in punitive type environments just for status offenses. Also prevented juveniles from having contact with adult offenders. So if you get picked up and you are a juvenile, you are not allowed to be housed with adult offenders. So this forces states, counties, etc., to build new institutions just for juveniles. Why do you think that is? What could possibly go wrong when we put, little Timmy, age 13, in the jail cell with, 6'5" Bubba? That's a big one. Definitely. I mean, that's probably the main one. Lots of abuse. The other idea, and this is a fabulous one, the original reason was because they felt that juvenile offenders would be easily influenced by adult offenders. And the issues around abuse didn't actually become a more prominent thing that we talked about until relatively recently. So the Prison Rape Elimination Act, for instance, didn't happen until 2009, maybe 1999. You can't hear me. It's fine. So basically, during the reform era, the idea here was that children and their families, because most of the time it's not just going to be the child, the parents are expected to show up as well. But justice should be, again, about reform. It should be about punishment. They're going to have separate courtrooms, separate detention centers to avoid corruption, and separate sentencing guidelines. We've talked a lot about the adult justice system and how, we're sort of aiming this direction because we find that the same is probably true for adults as well. But essentially, that juveniles are still developing, your brain is still developing, and that we can mold you into being a law-abiding, tax-paying citizen. Boop. At the same time, we still philosophically want people to be held accountable. Here's where things also get a little bit different. So you are presumed innocent, right? Same thing as adults. And the prosecutor in these cases is going to have for the most part, is going to have a somewhat less aggressive approach. We also want juveniles to have the least involvement with the system possible. So if it is safe, the accountability piece might be having a PO instead of being sent directly to an institution. It might mean, okay, instead of arresting this person, we're going to charge them, but we're not going to put them through the jailing process the way that we would with an adult and make them post bail and all that kind of thing if they're nonviolent. We watched that video a while back about the judge who was doing the opposite and what a big deal it was that they were doing, essentially treating juveniles like adults and carting them off to jail for very little reasons. But we are supposed to act in the best interest of the child. That is not the same as the adult system. In the adult system, we want to act in the best interest of the offender, but we also think about victims' rights, those kinds of things. Whereas with juveniles, the philosophy, it's a slight difference, but the philosophy is a little different in terms of we need to do what's best for this kid and their family if the family is safe. It's also confidentiality. So you will notice that if you read news articles, does anybody know the name of the kid up in Vancouver who started the Eagle Creek fire? You don't know the name because it was not in the news. Typically, these things are confidential. It differs state by state, but records are usually sealed. In Oregon, you can do public records requests and get court information, but you do not have access to things like mugshots, details of the crime, police reports, those kinds of things. You can only get like a name, a date, the charges. Unlike adults. With adults, you can put in a request and receive the whole case file for public records. Unless it's a sealed record for a specific reason. We will be getting to that, yes. There are 2 pieces of legislation in Oregon that allow for that. Because again, the idea here is that juveniles can change because your brain is still developing and we want to give them the opportunity to change. And so the record does not follow. And there's the confidentiality piece. We have seen that these principles are not always applied evenly. So as with adults, there's quite a bit of data that shows that these principles don't always apply equally to low-income children, to children who are people of color, and children with disabilities. All sort of the same marginalization issues that we see with adult offenders. There we go. Community-based corrections. So essentially, institutionalizing juveniles tends to be a last resort. Most of the treatments and reform is done in the community. The idea here, the philosophy, is that people should continue to grow in their communities. The justice tends to be a little bit more individualized, so we don't use the same kind of standardization. It is often left up to the judge, the officers involved, the PO, that kind of thing. Each case is supposed to be viewed separately. So while the history of that particular juvenile is going to be taken into account, it is done so much more subjectively. That could be a good thing. Where do you see it becoming problematic? Really? Absolutely. So there's definitely opportunity for abuse of power, like we saw with that video about the judge a couple weeks ago. Yep. Yep. So if each case is billed as its own sort of, discrete thing, and we're not looking at all of these other cases, other things that are happening, that can get a little sticky. So there's a difference, obviously, between the kiddo who does the thing once versus the kiddo who's on their 13th time. And we're going to want to look at why. Overall, though, the ideal is that folks are looking into the situation earlier on and try to prevent it from happening in the first place, sort of mitigate the circumstances around whatever the issue is so that it doesn't reach that level. So how did we end up here? What happens when cases end up being left to individual jurisdictions and the jurisdictions don't agree on how they should be handled? What's that? Yep, end up in the Supreme Court. So lots and lots and lots of Supreme Court cases here. You don't have to memorize these because your exam is open book, but you should know that they happened and you should know why they happened. So in Kent versus United States, 1966, keeping in mind how long juveniles have been incarcerated at this point, established that a juvenile case waived to adult system is still subject to due process. So that's that whole subjective thing, right? We're like, no, okay, let's back it up and let's make sure that these kids go through the same process in terms of making sure that they still have their rights. They still need to have an arraignment. They still need to actually be indicted. They still have a right to a trial, all of those things. So what happened is Morris A. Kent, 16 years old, detained and interrogated by police in connection with several incidents involving robbery and rape. Kent admitted some involvement, and so the juvenile court waived its jurisdiction and sent him all the way up to adult court immediately. So he was tried as an adult. He was indicted in district court. Basically, his attorneys and he decided or moved to dismiss the indictment because the juvenile court did not conduct a full investigation before sending him to adult court. So the U.S. Court of Appeals for D.C. affirmed after the jury found Kent guilty. So things get a little sticky. Goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court determined there was not a sufficient investigation prior to the juvenile court waiver of jurisdiction. So basically, before juvenile court can send you to adult court, they still have to go through due process, just like an adult would have access to. At this point, he was 21 at the time of the decision. So the court ordered that the conviction be vacated. They also decided in this case that the juvenile court can waive a case to adult court based on the age of the defendant at the time. So by the time this hit the Supreme Court, they basically said the juvenile court has to decide whether or not it's appropriate to waive it to adult court. And if the issue, let's say a juvenile court waives it to an adult court without due process and the person is still a juvenile, their sentence is, or their conviction is vacated. If they do so and the person is an adult at that point, it can be considered appropriate. So still a little sticky there. Galt in 1967, age 15. This is a good one. Accused of making an obscene call to a neighbor. Police came and picked him up. Yeah. I don't know. You are free to look it up. In fact, why don't you look it up and do a dramatic reading of the phone call? I really actually don't want you to do that. I mean, you can, but at any rate, he makes an obscene phone call to a neighbor. Whatever you would like to interpret that as. The police come and pick him up. They take him to a juvenile detention center while his parents are at work. Parents were later told that a hearing would be held the next day, but the charges were not explained. So there was no attorney present, only a judge heard the case. He was ordered to be sent to a state reform school until he was released or turned 21. So 7 years for a dirty phone call. Violating the 14th Amendment, yeah? What's the 14th Amendment say? Pocket Constitution? XIV.
Yeah, I said all persons born and naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state where they reside.
That's supposed to say Fourth Amendment.
That's supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it is.
Oops.
Well, people be secure in the person, so they get searches.
Yep. So he is illegally searched and seizured. What other amendment is being violated here? Yep, the attorney, which is what? Fifth Amendment. Interestingly enough, the Supreme Court did not rule on the Fifth Amendment piece. They only ruled on the Fourth, and I'm going to fix that on here, and I will update it on your stuff. Okay. Winship in 1970. It's a 12-year-old boy. He's convicted of larceny in New York. At the trial, the court relied on the preponderance of the evidence standard of proof, which we know is less stringent than proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So in the Supreme Court case, they said for juveniles, they are entitled to the state having to provide a burden of proof beyond a reasonable adult rather than just a preponderance of the evidence. They ended up reversing the conviction. Kiever versus Pennsylvania, 1971. This one is interesting. So, unlike the previous Supreme Court cases where they upheld certain adult rights for juveniles, in this particular case, they determined that juveniles do not have the right to a jury trial. Why do you think that is? Who makes up a jury? Yeah, your peers, right? Can we like pull a 13-year-old out to jury duty? Okay. Can you see it being problematic if we pull a group of peers to jury duty for some teenager? Yeah, that could get messy. So no right to jury trial. The wording in the actual court decision, let's see, it was a 6-3 decision, concluded that the previous application of other criminal rights to juveniles, like the right to counsel and cross-examinations, was done out of an emphasis on fact-finding. Quote, but one cannot say that in our legal system, the jury is a necessary component of accurate fact-finding. So they are not basing it on issues around putting kiddos on a jury. They are doing it essentially on a technicality that the jury's purpose is not to find facts, whereas the previous cases were based around this notion of fact-finding. So due process, making sure there's an attorney, search and seizure, evidence, all that kind of stuff. Additionally, the court noted that because juvenile prosecution is not considered either civil or criminal, because it's its own court, right? The whole of the Sixth Amendment does not necessarily apply. As such, there is no requirement for a jury trial in juvenile cases. You'll see this type of language in a lot of Supreme Court cases where it is based purely off of the way that the law is written and not necessarily off of the sort of moral or philosophical reason. Sometimes it's both. Typically it's both. But in this particular case, they needed to find some sort of legal statute that would back up the philosophical idea that we should not have other children on a jury. And Breed versus Jones in 1975. 17-year-old is found guilty in a juvenile court for acts that would be considered robbery if, excuse me, if he was in an adult court, but he wasn't. Then they decided to prosecute him as an adult as well. So basically double jeopardy. Can't do that. This was a unanimous decision. They delivered the opinion of the court vacating the lower court decision and remanded it, and they held that the criminal trial put Jones in jeopardy for a second time, suggested that juvenile courts make determinations about whether to try a juvenile as an adult at a preliminary hearing before any adjudication is made. So they still have to have due process because of Kent versus United States, but they have to decide ahead of time which court is going to handle that. They can't go like halvesies and then say, JK, we're going to send you to adult court. Still more Supreme Court cases. Mm-hmm.
On the slide, it said I
am. So in response to, like like you're getting a reply to an email kind of thing. Roper versus Simmons, 2005. So up until 2005, juveniles could receive the death penalty. In this case, it was determined that they cannot under the 8th Amendment, which is, anybody? Yep, cruel and unusual punishment. So this was a pretty contentious case when it happened because the crime itself was messy, quite literally. But the court pointed to overwhelming international opinion against the juvenile death penalty. There was a 5-4 decision, so not an easy decision. It was actually written by Judge Scalia. He was still around when you guys were alive, yeah? It was a really big deal when he was no longer in the court. Folks remember that? Okay. 2005. I mean, he didn't die right after that. He was around for a while. Graham versus Florida, 2010. So juveniles cannot receive life sentences for non-homicide types of offenses. So Terrence Graham is 16 years old. It was an armed burglary, attempted armed robbery, served a 12-month sentence and was released 6 months later. He committed another robbery, was sentenced in prison for life without parole for a new crime. There are actually 2 different opinions written for this one. So Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote for the majority. He reasoned that because the case implicates a particular type of sentence as it implies to an entire class of offenders, aka juveniles, that categorical analysis under Atkins, Roper, and Kennedy governs. So because of the previous cases, basically saying, okay, well, we have all these previous Supreme Court cases like Roper versus Simmons and a few others that say we are going to categorize juveniles all as one group, therefore we're going to do the same here. So that was one way that they did it. Under this approach, the court has to consider an objective indication of society standards, as with Roper versus Simmons, right? So we have to look at the societal standard and whether or not it is still socially acceptable to give the death penalty. At least in Roper versus Simmons, in this case, it's for a life sentence, but same kind of standard. Can we apply this socially acceptable standard to an entire class of people? And if the punishment in question for that class of people is considered unconstitutional. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote separately. He agreed with the judgment, but he gave different reasons and disagreed in the manner in which the majority reached the conclusion. And instead, he made his argument based on, number one, Supreme Court cases requiring what he called narrow proportionality review of non-capital sentences. So basically, we need to look at any sort of non-capital sentence as a class, as opposed to juveniles as a class. So type of crime versus type of person. Does that make sense? Slight distinction, but this is how the court writes things. And once again, citing the Roper versus Simmons case, that juvenile offenders should be considered less culpable than adults who commit the same crime, based on social acceptance, international consensus, so on and so forth. Miller versus Alabama and Jackson versus Hobbs is 2012. Here it was decided that life sentences without parole at all are unconstitutional under the 8th Amendment. Oh, we skipped one. JBD versus North Carolina, 2001. So you have to still give rights, Miranda rights, to juveniles if they are being questioned by police in school. So that includes school security officers, community resource officers, so on and so forth. And that you have to take the suspect's age into account when determining if they actually understand their rights. So if little Timmy is 9 and you're like reading the Constitution to him, you want to make sure he actually knows what it says, right? And that he understands it. So Miller versus Alabama and Jackson versus Hobbs. These were two cases that happened at the same time. They were both sent to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Courts ruled on, essentially wrote the same. They combined the two from the lower courts and wrote the same opinion for both and said, we're just gonna kill two birds with one stone, no pun intended, and decided that life sentences without parole are unconstitutional for juveniles under the 8th Amendment, including things like homicide. If you want to read about some disturbing crimes, you could look those two up there. Fun fellows. So how do people end up in the juvenile justice system? Many of the same reasons that people end up in the adult justice system, right? Because we know that adults don't magically change overnight on their 18th birthday. Did any of you? Maybe? No? Yeah, it's not really a thing. So the things that affect adults are generally the same thing that affect juveniles. So income, socioeconomic status, education, healthcare, mental health care, family background, trauma, attachment issues. And now we have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of research to show it. We're going to talk about ACEs. Notice that these are not listed as causes, they're listed as correlates because it's really hard to describe an etiology leading from something like low income to crime. If it's a really simple case, like I was hungry, so I stole food because I didn't have money, kind of makes sense. But when we're talking about these sort of overall kind of life conditions, it's difficult to measure or describe exactly how it ends up that way. So we call these correlates. Your book goes into some theoretical causes of juvenile delinquency, but most of them are extremely outdated theoretical models and don't have a lot of research backgrounds. Haven't really been accepted in the scientific community since around the 80s or so, so take them with a grain of salt. For example, they talk about the culture of poverty, not really a thing. No research to back it up. In fact, it's been disproven by the research quite a bit. Yeah. You also note that when your book talks about those things, you're not really going to see any citations, and it's because there are none, because it's just an idea. There's no research about it. So let's look at the things that actually have research. So the original ACEs study was done by Kaiser Permanente in 1998. Where's my mouse? basically, here are what we consider adverse childhood experiences. Look what that actually looks like. On Canvas, there is a link to, hey, look at that. An ACEs screener. This is the one that I use with my clients who are adults. This is a very, very simple screening tool. It's all just yes or no. In fact, you just check boxes. Notice how they are kind of vague. So lose a parent for any reason, right? Any kind of mental illness, depression, suicide attempt. Witnessing domestic violence. Living with somebody who ended up incarcerated. Emotional abuse, physical abuse. And notice that they don't call it that, right? We know that people answer questions more accurately when we describe the behavior than when we just say, were you abused, right? Nobody says yes to that. Some people do, most people don't. So this is the ACE score. What we find is that there is a huge correlation between ACEs and juvenile justice development. There's a video that we will come back to if we have time. Blah, blah. But that is on Canvas if you would like to take a look. This is basically just some of the research. This paper in particular is a good example of a systemic review. So you're all writing a literature review, go take a look at this one. It goes a little bit farther into detail than you all need to. You don't actually need to run any data, but when you look at the methods that are used in this paper, they describe the methodology through which they gather all of the research studies. That's what you'll all be doing for your literature review. So read this because it's interesting, but also read this because it's a good example. Let's talk about other assessments. So we want to find ways to objectively predict behavior, and we want to figure out how to handle people. There's an adult version of this. This is the youth LSCMI assessment. So this is used for case management. The idea here is, okay, well, we want to reform, right? We want to actually create a treatment plan per se so that we can help prevent people from committing crimes. So we have 42 items across 8 subsections, and we are going to interview and look at records, and we're going to ask the juvenile and their family and other people about these particular things, with the idea that we can measure each of these and we can use them to predict behavior. It also helps us form an actual reform or treatment plan. So if I see that the juvenile I'm working with is really struggling with substance use, that's going to be the thing that I focus on. This basically is a guide that we use to create case management plans. And this is also up on Canvas. You don't need to memorize it, obviously. It's just there, you know, you could do them on each other and write a paper on it. That would be amusing for me. The SAVRE. So this is a national assessment that is used. This one is a little bit different because it looks at a lot more in terms of more contextual risk factors. And it looks at protective factors. Lots and lots and lots of research on this particular assessment. It's used both in practice and in research, so you will find lots of studies on it. What are some of the things here that stand out to you? Things that we might use to try to predict risk? Anything that surprises you? No, no one is surprised whatsoever. Hmm? Yeah, absolutely. And it was something that wasn't really taken into account previously, and something that we don't always take into account for adults. We're getting better at it, but we know that if somebody has a high stress environment, but they don't have good coping skills, they're more likely than somebody that is in a high stress environment, but has good coping skills. And then obviously parent involvement. When we're working with adults, we don't typically look at things like family involvement, even though we know it's a protective factor. For instance, when I do suicide assessments, which is what I was doing last week, because I got a call at about 3:50 from a cop that said, "Hey, you're a client." And I'm like, "Okay, be there soon." We ask about things like family involvement because we know statistically that that is a protective factor when someone is deciding whether or not they want to kill themselves. But here we also see it used for criminality. We're going to try to measure someone's risk for committing a crime based on things like, do they have coping skills? Do they have family involvement? Are their parents managing them in ways that are appropriate as opposed to inappropriate? Do they have support? And then also the entire community. So not just the individual, but the community that they live in as well. What kind of community supports are available? In Oregon, we wrote our own because paying for, you know, national, very, very well, sort of strongly research validated assessments is expensive. So in Oregon, we like to write our own. We have the Oregon Youth Authority Risk Needs Assessment, which looks at a lot of the same things. It's based on an assessment done in Washington, but kind of combines different things. This one is also available on Canvas. So in this one, we don't separate out, we're not separating the protective factors from the risk factors by category. We're doing it by domain. So instead of talking about, hey, what are all your risk factors? And then, hey, what are all your protective factors? We're looking at each of these. We're saying, okay, risk factors and protective factors about education. Okay, about vocation. Okay, about caregivers, so on and so forth. So each domain is scored from a -100 to a +100, and the score goes negative to positive depending on risk factors versus protective factors. So let's say you have lots and lots of risk factors, but you also have lots of protective factors in that domain. That's going to push your score up. These typically use lots and lots of records. My favorite thing about this, and I'll show it to you on here, and you can look at cool. The instruction manuals on here. The instructions are great, and it kind of goes through how each of these is measured, why they're measured that way. So I think these are fun. Try to convey openness, respect, and support. The youth should not feel judged or belittled. Don't be a dick when you're asking people about like their trauma history and their life and whether their dad beats them and stuff, okay? This was put into writing for a reason. You don't typically see this type of instructions with a research tool, so we'll just leave it at that. Youth who come to OYA are often struggling in one or more of these areas. It's a great read. You should read it. But then it actually does go into the assessment itself. So you will see the kinds of questions that are asked. Note that this is used for what we're calling current risk. So current risk in this way is measured in the last 90 days. So if we're looking at potential for harm to self, harm against others, that kind of thing, we're looking at have they engaged in this particular type of behavior recently? We're not talking about a year ago, we're talking about last 90 days. We have remote history, and then we have recent history, and then kind of current issues. All sorts of questions here. So that's what that looks like. So case flow, shifting gears again. One of the great things about the juvenile court is that oftentimes people will end up elsewhere so that they don't end up having to be incarcerated. This can, again, be things like a non-law enforcement agency. So Children's Farm Home down in Corvallis from by Trillium Youth and Family Services. That's for kiddos that have mental illness. It's essentially the equivalent of the state hospital. So folks get sent to treatment instead of getting charged or convicted, or let's say they are convicted, but they're sentenced to treatment instead. They take all kinds of those cases. You can be held in a secure detention facility, again, for non-status offenses. You have the choice whether or not to file a case in juvenile or criminal court, meaning adult court. A disposition has to be reached. You can't just be there forever. But there, again, is a lot of discretion available for whether or not you are committed to, say, residential treatment facility, like a group home kind of thing, actual incarceration, a secure treatment facility. There's lots of options here. The other thing that is different here is that with some placements and up to the judge's discretion, the placement can be reevaluated. So if you're sentenced to prison with no parole, no good time, and no programming. So like Bobby that was here a couple weeks ago, he qualified for a specific program that allowed him to be out of the institution, but still under state jurisdiction. With juveniles, there are more options in terms of reevaluating throughout the sentence. So let's say you're in residential treatment, you're going to be reevaluated multiple times at specific intervals, depending on the state, depending on the county, to see if you still need to be there or not, if you are still considered a risk. Unless you have a judge that says, no, you're getting sentenced to this for exactly this long. And, you know, but there's a lot more leniency, especially when it's for treatment facilities or residential placements, as opposed to something like McLaren, the detention center. There's also juvenile aftercare. So basically having a parole probation officer, one of the folks that's coming here tonight, supposed to be coming, runs that program. Can ask her lots about what that looks like. And last but not least, records, a big, big, big component of this idea of reform and aftercare is the confidentiality piece. So ORS 419 allows for expunction of a juvenile case record upon request and approval. Could be said, judge could say yes, judge could say no, you could reapply. And then in 2021, this allowed for automatic expungements. This was a really, really big deal when it happened. There are exceptions, and if you look at the actual bill text, which I think I put on here, did I? Let's hope I did. Nope, go back. Hey, there it is. Yeah, we know. Blah 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 blah. Where is that? There's the list. If you do these things, you don't get automatic expungement for obvious reasons. And the other thing this bill does that is new is that it entitles you to an attorney through the expungement process. So pretty big deal. Read it if you're interested. Yeah. If you have one of these offenses, the juvenile can still apply for expungement based on the revised statute, but they don't get it automatically. Notice this language here. Commission of an act which, if done by an adult, would constitute one of the following offenses. And that's because we don't have the same names for charges for juveniles, right? Because it's juvenile court, not criminal court. The way that these laws are written, they all are written for criminal court. So instead of just rewriting them all, they say if done by an adult. Okay. So some controversies. Because of the whole confidentiality thing and this idea that people can be reformed, there is controversy around whether or not we should use juvenile records when sentencing people later in life. The Oregon sentencing grid, which we'll be looking at some point over the next few weeks, the answer is yes. In some states, they look at the actual charges. In other states, they just look at whether or not the person has a record at all. Another controversy is around juvenile sex offender registries and whether or not they are effective at preventing crime, which is kind of the whole point, as opposed to being punitive. And the jury is still out on that in terms of the research. When I was an undergrad, I was interning at a juvenile sex offender program. And Pennsylvania at the time wrote a law that created a juvenile sex offender registry. And it was a pretty big deal because it wasn't really known whether or not that was actually going to be a useful thing, but it was created based on one particularly high profile case in Pittsburgh. There was a youth that very violently sexually assaulted several peers at his school. And how do you create a sex offender registry that says you can't go within this many feet of a school if the person is a student, right? So what does that actually look like? What is the purpose of it? Is it effective? What does it do? Does it actually help? There's a lot of open-ended questions, and there's not really clear research yet because it's a relatively recent thing. These didn't start becoming a thing until the last 30 years or so. So we're still kind of waiting on the research for that. Oh, take a break. This is Fennec. He's a criminal, as you can see. Vandalism, killing of a plant. Yeah. Sure is. But he's relevant because he is also only a juvenile. If Simba, the orange cat, did this, that would be very different because he's old enough to know better. This little criminal, however. What's that? He is that window used to be full of plants. There are now 2 plants. And I'm not sure what rehab is going to look like for Sir Fennec yet. What's that? He's also a criminal because he has learned we have child locks on the treat cabinet because he will steal the kitty crack. And yeah, and he's small enough so the big boy, he'll paw at the treats. They've got a whole, this isn't actually an organized crime situation because all the treats are kept in the same cabinet. So Simba, the big boy, he can stick his paws in there, but the little man here can get his whole little skinny ass into the cabinet, and then he'll just knock shit out of there, and then the dog comes over and takes her portion, and then all of the treats are all gone, and then nobody gets treats. So there's like a mob. I'm not sure who the ringleader is yet because I haven't caught it in action. Yeah, I'm not spending that much money on these little shits. They're already so expensive. You know how expensive these plants are? Or like having to rebuy treats like every other week because they break in and eat all of them and then like their belly hurts. Then I gotta buy extra litter because he like got sick because he ate all the treats. That's great. Yeah, it's disgusting. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yep. There is a fee. So that is also an issue, right? For folks that who are socioeconomically disadvantaged and you have to pay for that process if you end up having to pay for an attorney, right? It says that you have to be appointed an attorney, but you can still be responsible for paying that attorney if you meet the income requirements. So yeah, it's problematic.
Do you have the same rights to request for a different attorney, or would they say like, oh, you're not?
If you can pay for one, yeah.
Like, sometimes when the lawyer instead goes to bias,
yeah, but you do have to have approval from the judge. So same for adults. If you request a different attorney, it changes the case, and so you have to get approval from the judge and essentially say why you want a different attorney and so on and so forth. Hi.
Hi, I just have a question about the contract.
Okay, let me pause record. Put this over here somewhere. I'm gonna put it by you. Damn.
You should know better than to trust me with your computer.
Well, have fun. What's that? Great idea. Would you all like to introduce yourselves? Ooh, that's a fun sound.
Oh, it's the hybrid.
Well, if I say or out or whatever. So I'm supposed to record my lectures. The free way to do that is these.
Really? Okay. You're mostly in the screen.
I know, like maybe. I was just saying we should go for seniority, which as we just covered with you.
Okay.
Can I plan this out?
So what's the class? I talked about criminal justice, but what do you like in the class?
So this is Introduction to Criminal Justice, and today we're talking about the juvenile justice system, hence why I came here. So we talked about corrections, and I brought in my former employees / recently released inmates. A couple weeks before that, we talked about patrol police investigations. We had some friendly folks from Washington County, and we are here to answer questions about what juvenile justice actually looks like in the real world and not just in the textbook. Also, folks, when you ask questions, please stand up, and we have one person who reads lips.
Okay. Hi, my name is Clint McClellan. I'm the Assistant Director of Facility Services. That means I oversee all of the corrections. And we have 8 other facilities. Burns, Philadelphia, Lawrence, Grants Pass, Albany, the Grand, and Burns. I've been working for the Oregon Authority for 34 years. I'm retiring in
So there's an opening in case.
yeah. The interest. So yeah, that's kind of just worked my way up through the system. I started as a direct care called the Group Life Coordinator out of college. They went off with system, but it's been an amazing career. The field is awesome. Working with those kids that are, we've been tasked with working with over the past 34 years, but even more as more time goes by, the decades go by. Decades. Yeah. The kids are getting tougher and tougher. We have less kids in the system, but the ones that we do have are so one of the first times they told me to have relationships, positive role model relationships with the that's not an exaggeration. So we have a big opportunity, a big obligation. It's very rewarding. I'm not trying to sell anything. So that's why. Thanks.
You said go by seniority, and I think you're next.
So I'm Dr. Brian Hartman. I'm the supervising psychologist for Oregon Youth Authority. What that means is I'm over health for all of the facilities. So I oversee, I have the clinical oversight of the 3 treatment service supervisors and then the approximately 30 QMHP positions. Those positions are all housed in Clint's department, but then I do the supervision and sort of provide the guidance for that part. So in some ways, it's kind of the best of both worlds because I get to sort of help, provide the leadership for treatment services. I get to do a lot of the things that I want to do, and I don't have to do any of the annoying things like signing or approving leave requests, schedules, things like that. So that's kind of nice. I just get to go and, deal with the kids that are having challenges, which is kind of what I love to do, and help the Qs with doing their job like that. Them support the youth on a daily basis.
Does anybody know what a QMHP is?
I wasn't sure if you hit that with POC. Qualified mental health professional.
Right? See, now we left.
They all agree.
Looks like someone had a question.
Yeah, it's about to ask.
I was just going to ask what your typical I was like, it's really
I don't really have anything that remotely approaches a typical day because with 9 facilities, my days can go from I'm sitting there doing, so every youth when they come into a correctional facility has to have an intake psychological assessment. So I'm responsible for scheduling all those with the contractors that do them. And so I may be just doing scheduling stuff, plugging things into the spreadsheet for who's going to be where, creating the calendar and putting that out. There may be a suicide attempt somewhere that will sometimes actually require me to go in. So there is literally no such thing as a typical day. And it can go that wide range. A lot of the time it does involve just a lot of meetings. Which I will say with 9 facilities, I don't know how you used to do it, Clint, because I'm trying to figure out how I would watch over 9 facilities, blue mental staff, 9 facilities without the use of teams. I have no idea. I cannot fathom that. I travel a lot as is. I've been to every facility except Florence now. So, but I've heard that. That's literally what it is. It really depends. It depends on what's going on, what the situations are in various places where we're having the problems.
How many psych majors?
Ooh. So,
Hi, everyone. I'm Sandra Santos. I am the Assistant Director of Community Services at the Oregon Youth Authority. So I oversee all of parole and probation across the state, as well as our community residential programming that are either BRS residential or some independent living programs and some non-traditional residential programs, and our foster care program as well. So I actually kind of have a non-traditional path to juvenile justice, and I am going to try to sell juvenile justice to you all because it isn't probably the first thing that people that comes to mind in a criminal justice degree or even a psych degree. I have a master's in social work, and I was a licensed clinical social worker, and I was a therapist for a while and worked in nonprofit agencies and social service agencies, and kind of found myself drawn to the toughest kids, which is what we work with, are the youth who are deemed for whatever reason to not be safe in the community, to not be able to participate in whatever treatment or services that they need to become productive citizens while still living in the community. So OYA is kind of the last stop for them. So there are like different levels of juvenile justice. There's county level, which is where I started my career in juvenile justice. I was a juvenile probation officer at the county level. And then when you're not successful at in the community at county level, then they're escalated up into the Oregon Youth Authority, where they're often placed first in either a correctional facility or where Clint is, or a residential program, which I oversee. So our youth are supervised in the community, have conditions that are given by the judge. We have, you all have heard of like POs or whatever, parole officers or probation officers, and that's what my staff do. So it is very rewarding work, but it's tough. It's a tough group of kids, and you have to just really love juvenile delinquents. You just have to love them, and so I think all of us, we do. Like, we're drawn to the kids who have the toughest stories and the most challenging behaviors, and really healthy, normal human beings want to run away from those kids. That's a really normal reaction. And for some of us, we are drawn to that population for whatever reason. Yes, ma'am.
So this could be a question for any of you.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So as we're considering our careers, like the risk of our own mental health is a major factor that we tend to think about. How do you deal with the things that you see and deal with on a day-to-day basis? Are there any things you do in specific, like especially how long you've been doing it, you know?
Comment about normal, healthy human beings draw away, and then there are the rest of us.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good. Since I'm the oldest here, that's probably worst at doing that, taking care of myself, because I think traditionally that was kind of an afterthought. It's like, oh, you pick this word, you deal with it. You know? You're gonna see a lot, and you gotta suck it up and figure out how to work through it. I think a lot of people built more. I think a little bit more with a little bit more resilience, just naturally. But it'll wear and tear on me. And so we have learned a lot, I think, by the last 10 years, at least, maybe 15, of trying to get that work-life balance and get therapists to be in it and have a support group around you can talk through stuff, you know, just let things sit, simmer. It could be small things that build up. We've heard of vicarious trauma and all of the other things that can happen. That does happen. I'm not going to say it might happen. It does happen in our environments. And as I think there's two ways. If I don't take care of myself, I'm not able to help anybody take care of themselves, right? And if I'm modeling, just suck it up and move on. that's just detrimental, and it just builds, and pretty soon people are burned out. I think we lose a lot of really good people, and kids lose out on a lot of really awesome people because of just the lack of doing that. So we try to give people extra services through the state, mental health assistance, and we try to do a lot of debriefing on incidents to ensure we take care of folks and have at least opportunity to, hey, that was rough, take a day or go home, and and then a lot of check-ins and kind of slowly reintegrate folks that have seen some really tough stuff. We have an employee support team that has in each facility that has their duty to follow up with folks, ensure they need to take care of that. For the most part, it's one of those shift work is a lot of our employees have shift work, and the opportunities to really be able to have extra time off or do it's so rare and difficult because of coverage of staff. So we do end up with a lot of folks that fall through the cracks because we are kind of systemically set up to take care and make sure we have those extra bodies of folks, especially now during COVID. Nobody wants to do this. It's an ongoing issue.
Yeah, I think in any like social serving, service kind of career, anytime you're working with people, there is a potential for vicarious trauma or burnout. And so, I mean, for me personally, everyone is individual. There was a point, I got to a point, and I felt like I've always practiced really strong self-care. I definitely take care of myself, and I work out, and I do yoga, and I do all the things that you're supposed to do. And it's sometimes it's just not enough. I in my career got to a point where I felt like I was just oversaturated with the stories and the relationships with my clients and stuff. And that was when I decided I need to make a move, and I moved into a management position versus direct care. And it was just recognizing that I felt like it was hurting my heart. And I still wanted to impact the youth. It's my entire career I've worked with high risk adolescent youth. And I just decided for myself, because I was going home and telling crazy, talking about stuff that I shouldn't have been talking about with my family. It's not dinner talk, what we experience and what we see. And so you make the right decision for yourself and your family. And but yeah, I mean, and it's extremely rewarding work. And you get to impact a lot of lives, and it is not for the faint of heart, that's for
sure. Really, my only addition in beyond what these two said, which is 2% accurate, is that I also have been at that point and was where she saw it. Where when I was in OSH, I was working with literally worse and worse. And I got to a point where I was burned out, like script with private practice, doing forensic evals and such for a year and a half, and then it was like, okay, I also want I have to figure out something better. And so I ended up at OIA, which I actually really love, and it gets me back to my kid roots along with my forensic and correctional roots, and so I'm able to have that joy with it. But like Senator said, I'm in management, and so means that I have to have that like all day, every day thing, and my own way of doing it, debatable how healthy it is, but hey, it works, is that, I intermingle my day. So like my day literally will start at 4 a.m. and I will, I'm still responding to cues of like to the QMHPs of like 9 o'clock at night. And I just intersperse out my day though. So it's like, I'll get up in the morning, try to get hands around what's happened overnight. I'll have a morning meeting, take it, I'll go work out for an hour or two, back home, shower, get ready, work for a while, then work for a while, then have to go get my daughter, get her somewhere, get back and work some more, and I spread it out, and that makes it actually a little bit easier for me. It also makes it easier when I need to go hit a facility, and that's one of the that's sort of for me what works is that if I can break it out over my day, and that also helps because I am pretty much 24/7, 365 on call. And so I have to always be able to, so that allows me to have that sort of ability to sort of spread things out. And then just finding things you enjoy. Like I'll go, I love to ride my motorcycle, so I will literally take my motorcycle to go to facilities. Like I rode to Rogue Valley a few weeks ago. Would have ridden out to Burns a couple days before that, except it was snowing. I'm like, okay, I have limits. And it's all about finding ways to work things in to just help keep going.
Have you been exposed to juvenile justice, what a juvenile department does? You know what that role is and how they get clients. Do you have exposure like that?
We had an hour of lecture and that's it.
So just for a little background, in case you all are actually considering, I know it's the introductory class, but in case any of you might actually be interested in going into juvenile justice, there is no like traditional like education that is required to get into juvenile justice. There's all kinds of backgrounds. People have criminal justice degrees, people have psychology degrees, counseling, social work, human behavior, like any kind of background where you learn about people is probably fine. It's really a passion for working with tough kids. But so any youth that gets like in adult language arrested is those reports are sent to the local county juvenile department, and they make a decision based off of the charges and the nature of the crime and that particular individual, how that youth will be worked with. And so likely an intake will be done, an assessment, and they make decisions on the needs of the youth, whether that youth actually has to be officially like formally adjudicated and go through the court system, or whether they can be worked with informally, which is ideal, so that they don't actually go through the formal court system, because sometimes what we know is our system can do more harm than good sometimes. So they do try to divert a lot of youth and not send them down that path. But so, and then they're worked with in a number of ways. And what I always like to help people understand is the juvenile justice system is drastically different than the adult criminal justice system. And we very much are motivated. Rehabilitation is a real thing in the juvenile justice system. We understand that our incarceration is really the last step that we have to take for community safety. Really the goal of the juvenile justice system is to provide the support, the services. All of our youth have experienced trauma. I mean, I think we could safely say all of the youth involved in our system have experienced some type of trauma. So we know that there's healing to be done and skills to be built and connections to be made with the positive adults and other positive people in kids' lives. And so it's a field that you go into to not where the old system is not like it is anymore. We're not just trying to lock kids up. We're not just trying to consequence our way out of these issues. We really are working very hard to provide kids with skills, with connections, family counseling, mental health support, all of the things that they need to move away from their current predicament. And most of them do. That's the fantastic part, is that a lot of kids come through our system. It's really just a tiny percentage of all the kids out in the world, but fortunately they all get past this time of their lives and they do better. So it's yeah. So if you just wanted to make sure you understand kind of how kids come to us and come through our system. It's not a voluntary. Parents can't just drop their kids off at McLaren. Although, they might drive them by there and be like, this is where you're going to end up. You can't just say, I want my kid locked up. You can't just, drop them off and say, I'm not taking my kid home. That's not how it works. It's all based off of law violations.
The individual that was with us that came and spoke, is that what you said? Somebody came and talked to you that, oh, I thought you said like a graduate of our system.
The adult system.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Thought you had some. So I was going to say they must have had some insight on what kind of the differences are between like a punitive environment that we used to have versus more of a developmental environment.
That's what most of what we talked about today. People are more example of the community pieces. what sort of programs? You know, we briefly touched on like, okay, well, there's residential, there's, you know, like the contact stuff, there's, you know, parole, probation, but some of those more informal interventions.
So, do you all understand the difference between parole and probation? I know people kind of throw those two terms around. Who knows?
I'm gonna say.
I feel like someone in this room understands. So some youth, so probation is like when the judge decides in lieu of going to like prison, for lack of better terms, a youth is supervised in the community on probation. So they always could be, if they don't do well, then they can be revoked and put into a facility, but it's instead of going to prison. So some of those kids are on probation, and we put them into residential programs to hopefully meet their needs and be able to get them back out into the community, but they're on probation. So parole, on the other hand, is when a youth is committed into a correctional facility and then they're paroled out. Does that make sense? So kids who are on probation, ideally, don't ever have to go to a correctional facility, but they are still worked with and supervised. We have all types of different residential programs, some that address behavioral needs and have school and have treatment within the program. We have independent living programs, working on getting some culturally specific programming, just drug and alcohol, dual diagnosis stuff, so mental health and drug and alcohol. Small programs of just, some of the programs just have like 5 kids. So they just really are tailored to try and meet the needs. And they're still not, we still don't have enough programming, or maybe the right programming that meets every young person's needs. There's a lot of work that we have to do. We have foster homes as well. And I think a lot of people have heard of foster homes through the child welfare system. And I don't think everyone is familiar that the Oregon Youth Authority also has child welfare. It is. Right. So you have had some exposure to it. So our foster care is, for folks who need to have, we're trying to get as close to what a biological family might look like, but for whatever reason, that young person may or may not have be able to do that. So we have our own foster care system that's different and distinct from DHS, but with similar type programming. Yeah, I don't know. And then we just have youth that live at home. We have kids that live with their families. We have kids that live on their own. We can supervise youth longer than county probation officers can. So we have kids that are young adults that are your age, 22, 23, 24.
So I was in a facility for a while, and I learned about this people. That's what it's called. I would Washington.
Yeah.
So, yeah, is that
Very similar. I haven't been there, but a lot of folks that had some tours up there, they came down and visited with us also. And it was a similar setup. So yeah, how long ago were you there?
Last year. A little different.
I think they just.
Yeah, there was some stuff with COVID and such. They gave me a dog when they left, actually.
Wow. Amazing. Yeah.
So I mentioned one of the reports about records for juveniles is so they're teenagers that can sex but they formally have a maybe to be for school and they have to go to school, how that treated or how's that needs to be.
Do you want me to answer?
Yeah.
So they're not put on a registry while they're under our supervision. That is not until after. So clearly it would be impossible to say that a young person who was convicted of a sex crime could not be around other young people, because we put them in facilities and other programs where that's where they are. They're in school, they're under supervision. So the registry piece is something that comes after. And a lot of times with juvenile crimes, there are ways to do, I think they call it like conditional postponement or something like that, where they have an opportunity, relief for registration, where they have an opportunity to not have to register if they've completed the appropriate treatment and all of the services that they need. It is a challenge. And so, yes, I think by the time they come to us, it's because it's probably been some pretty serious crimes. A lot of the lower level sex offenses, I mean, kids can get charged for anything from like bra snapping, pantsing someone, like that stuff is usually never rises to the level of having to be adjudicated on or things like that. So
that was a recent law that was passed, the opportunity to apply for relief registration when we need to do so. I believe it was very beneficial. That followed a lot of young kids that made the decision to for some bad environments and tagged for life. So
for those of you who have chosen that as your paper topic, when you research it, you'll see that recidivism for juvenile justice is very, very great. Juvenile experience, for instance, a lot of programs about things like teaching what is sexist, and teaching different skills, but also addressing other types of social needs. For affecting the behavior was allow to happen. And so we know that this kind of program should business pretty well. So the need for a registry is less and less if we have success. Oregon, we don't have that treatment for adults. It's not at the correctional level. We believe that it's a level that really supports.
Yeah, part of the concern that we have with youth, a lot of the youth who have those type of crimes come to us because the victim is in the home and they can't return home. And so they're not our highest risk in a whole lot of ways. They simply aren't able to live in the community because they don't have a viable place. What else?
I know you have more questions. You had lots of questions.
there's one.
Oh, good. I have that bias as well. If you acknowledge a bias, then
yeah. They actually have bonus points for doing the IAT, so
that's
it's
fun.
still available for your time.
Those are fun.
So are there like benefits to having versus not? And then I guess I'm about two-parter. And then what avenues can you go with in master level or like license?
Oh, that's a great question.
And this might be where the two of us might battle.
I was gonna say,
Okay, this might be a debate.
Yeah, I mean, on top of it, I also teach in the social work program at Portland State, so I'm like super biased, and I truly believe, and the reason why I went to teaching at the social work program is because I would like to bring more social workers into the juvenile justice world. I'm not gonna say one is better than the other, but social work is better. And
Oh, no, I'm just saying community versus mental health.
Oh no, I think they're all very important. Social work specifically, there's just a broad stroke that you get when you get a social work degree that is less focused than like a counseling specific degree. And the clinical track, I mean, when you're going for your license, you are very, very focused on a clinical track. So likely people who get their LCSW are people who are, you have to be supervised for a couple of years and do direct clinical work and pass this big hard test. But in general, for billing and for insurance purposes, social work was first in the state of Oregon, I believe, what accepted, the insurances would accept that degree first. And so there's just more kind of long-term kind of foundation with social work. I think it gives you a nice broad picture of both social justice issues, racial justice issues. You can take a clinical track. It's a little bit different than some of the other degrees, and you're not kind of stuck into like the clinical direction. Social work in juvenile justice, I think, is really because there's such a big piece about racial justice issues and the disproportionate minority contact in the juvenile justice system is very, very real, in the criminal justice system across the board. Having the education and understanding around the impacts of racism on our communities of color and how that translates into our overrepresentation in our juvenile justice system is it's really valuable information to have. So yes, I'm very biased about the social work degree, and I think there are lots of different educational backgrounds that people can have to come into the juvenile justice system. But I just think social work's better. So good job.
Does that stay still up for the MSW of the age program?
I don't know. I don't know that.
That's also a good option. That's something that I did. So also, you know, because he's been in psychology.
I wasn't putting up for psychology. I was just putting up for facilities.
It has to be psychology, but the MSW program is a good option for folks who want to take both the micro and the macro work. Because when you do the public health program, you're learning a lot of the statistics and a lot of the big picture stuff, and you're also learning how to conduct research and how to conduct specific types of statistical analyses and do sort of the epidemiological piece of what mental health and all the social issues look like, while still getting the sort of micro therapy type training. Pretty along with kind of that big picture, you know, what is structural resistance, what is structural process, and all that. And those of you who are psychology degrees are also learning about how to do all that micro stuff. Whether it's the MTVs you learn, not just okay, here's what this study says, and here's how you're about to add it, but also how can you compile data in very specific ways to create the different types of narratives that you then learn how to put into practice, either as a clinical psychologist or as a clinical social worker. So lots of options.
That sounds way better.
As no.
Yeah.
As for what you I was gonna say, as for what you do, as for what you do with it, you know, I will say this: it is a very versatile degree. The QMHPs that we have, some of my favorite QMHPs are social workers. They're ones I can pretty solidly count on, and they're the ones when I have to make a decision. They're often the ones I go to. And it's not just the clinical work, like the facilities folks I work with in facilities management, that the ones I work most closely with have that social work background. So, you know, it puts you into where you can also be in the leadership portion of it as well. So
what's the minimum age to work? You said director staff?
21.
Okay. So similar, it's essentially the equivalent of a correctional officer, except notice the change in language. Why do you think that is? Why do we not call them correctional officers or security officers?
Yes. But it kind of sounds to me like current control model.
Technically, the juvenile counselor is the title for the county level juvenile probation officers. They're not called probation officers. Now, some of the youth are on probation, but they call them juvenile counselors, and that's exactly why, because the goal is to counsel, support, mentor, coach, hold kids accountable, and not to just be you know, their probation officer.
What about for the facilities perspective, like for the staff? Do they kind of have that shift in terms of how they think about it?
I'll just keep this short. I can just say yes.
You're plenty of time.
Well, okay. So we've made a shift. When I started, it was very much a child welfare. in facilities, and that was in the late 80s. Sorry. And when, I don't know if you guys have talked about Measure 11 yet, but in the mid-90s, Measure 11 came around as kind of a super predator era. A lot of big kind of crazy crimes happened with young people, and so this kind of fear went everywhere. The law and order, the hammer came down with the law in Oregon places was that we're doing mandatory minimum sentencing for anybody 15 years of age or older that has a person crime. So there were kids. We had to in 1994 start building facilities because we knew they were coming. And we went from a 600 number, I think, to almost double that in youth correctional facilities. And we filled these facilities, and these facilities were funded by the state government who passed that law that wanted to get tough on crime. So our new facilities became very correctional and institutional shells, at least. What went on inside is a little different, but they're very much stark, kind of cold, not developmental environments at all. And so we had these staff generally that were raising this child welfare approach, kind of getting thrown into this environment and this new expectation. And it wasn't but 5 to 10 years we completely shifted into a very correctional environment. I would say, you know, probably over half the people or 3/4 of people that worked with the kids were very much law and order. You do this, that's just it. And if you don't, there's a major consequence. So we're going to punish things out of you, which was the opposite model of what works, as we know, and reduces public safety and improves it. So about 10 years ago, we started a new approach called positive human development, which is the development model. We've heard of positive youth development. It's based on the same principles. And so we've been working on that model of shifting that correctional to a developmental environment facilities for about 8 years, 9 years. And we have made amazing changes and improvements in creating environments that are safe for kids, that they can attach and belong and learn new skills and practice those skills and really equip them to move on. So yes, and with that, I think an example of that is we, in these mid-90s and into the 2000s, our staff kept collecting things like badges on the shirt and like duty belts and like handcuffs and things that made them look like a SWAT team member versus someone there to help them develop. And so one of the first things we did when we came in is we just said, nope, no more of that. And it raised a big thing, but now everybody wears t-shirts, OA t-shirts and hoodies. And that's how we kind of operate. We took that wall that was their natural wall, and we started building new facilities that looked very much different, a lot of natural light, a lot of normative kind of things. So that development happened as well over the last 10 years.
I think you had a question.
That was kind of similar to her question. I know you talked about different track for social work versus psychology. I was wondering kind of like what are the other roles? Obviously, I know your guys are management roles, but what about someone that's not necessarily majoring in psychology counseling? So my major is actually business management, and a minor in criminal justice. So that's what I'm saying. So kind of like seeing what other roles are in the juvenile system.
Yeah, we have a whole business services department, and which is vital to the work that we do. I don't know what kind of business that you want to get into, but we have human resources and our financial folks and our facilities, like that business piece. Like there's a lot of different parts, and I see a lot of people who still want to contribute to the positive outcomes of young people, but like it's just not you. Like you don't want, like you're not the one that you want to go and work directly with these young people. And there are definitely ways to be involved in a system like ours and contribute because it's important too, and not necessarily do that direct care with youth. So there's all kinds of things that our business services folks do.
They literally keep the lights on.
Yes.
Depending on if you decide to move forward with your master's, you can pick pretty much everything, right? You don't have to have a bachelor's in whatever course you get. The master's in the same. I think a lot of master's programs are in lots of options.
Make a ton of money.
Well, I mean, not as much as you do if you go into psychology.
Nobody goes into social work for the money. But if you get the right education and you work your way up, it's not, you don't have to be broke.
And you can always supplement it by teaching you the things like someone wants to do. Yes, there are again a lot of different. If you work for something like OA, if you work for a state agency, especially in Oregon, you kind of take care of it.
Yeah, the compensation is different in working for government agencies versus working in community nonprofit. So, but everyone puts in their time and starts. You got to start somewhere. I mean, I started working for community nonprofits, making $11.25 an hour. That's with a degree. So.
Really fun.
Is there anyone that's actually, I mean, interested in coming into the juvenile justice field or working with youth in some kind of capacity? Okay, that's fantastic. And so I'd say one of the like myths that I try to constantly dispel, although it's not 100% myth, is that like working for a juvenile justice system is working in an oppressive way. And a lot of people want to work with our population, but they want to work, you know, in mental health or in social service agencies and stuff. And so, although I would say any system is probably oppressive, and that's just what it is. I think that the juvenile justice system is working very hard nationwide to be more progressive and to meet the needs of, because ultimately the goal is community safety, and healing is what promotes community safety in my mind. So I think that's just a different lens on things.
And I will say that for those who are interested in the health side of things, sadly, due to just the reduction of available services in the community, we can kind of refer to this. We much like prison is, we are kind of the last resort for a lot of kids. So we have units that look very much like mental health units. So very much like, you know, like mental health facilities. And that's because a lot of our population at this point, we just do the numbers on this. 92% of our youth had a diagnosable mental disorder that does not include conduct disorder, oppositional defiance, impulse control, and or substance use. So even after tossing those out the window, it's still 92% have diagnosis. It is unfortunately where a lot of these kids end up. So if you do want to do those sort of, it's not, yeah, providing it in a lot of facilities that I've worked for hospitals that are also blocked. It's inherently oppressive and coercive by its nature. It also doesn't give you a chance to actually help kids get out. I think of one young lady from Oak Creek that was nobody, like she hated everybody when she came in. There were like 2 of us that she glommed onto. And I went to see her the day before she went out, and last I heard from her, she was still doing great. And you don't see that sort of change a lot of places.
A little bit about the mental health services. So like if somebody's like community or community, kind of what sort of work we're doing in terms of assessment and treatment and delivering services that
So as of right now, we only have QMHPs. We have a separate set of administrative roles and school units. So we currently have QMHPs. What the QMHPs do is they kind of guide treatment in a lot of ways. They Anybody who has mental health issues, they're just be saying what those interventions are going to be. They're helping the team support the youth in all of their programming and sort of checking in. There's a lot of suicide assessments that happen at this point. We just revamped the suicide assessment policy because unfortunately that is an increasing problem in every aspect of our society, and particularly in juvenile justice. Take a kid away from everyone that they know, lock them up, and suddenly start to have more problems. So they're kind of people that work on the mental health side, they are the center of every youth. Every youth has PMHP. So,
it's also very different from the adult system where only certain nurses. Prevention. Daily program in terms of sports. They're not just, they're facility, right? They're actually some sort of.
We have a couple different levels of facilities. Also, I'll point out we have the main facilities, which are fence and you can't go outside the fence, and that's where you usually start your time. And those programs are at the front end very assessment heavy, full psychological. You get all of the assessments to kind of determine where the best placement is going to be. When you get on a regular living unit, we try to make it as normative as possible, and not real structured, but not like overly structured, I would say. So you can imagine most of our, about half now of our facilities have dormitories and not single rooms or cells, so to speak. So, youth get up probably 6:30-ish, 7 in the morning, do their kind of a normal thing that you would do. Get something to eat, take care of yourself, you clean your area, and you might have a little bit of half hour or so to ensure that you're kind of getting ready for your day. And then it's either school or work or vocational opportunity. School is anywhere from K through 12. We have full school, teachers at all levels of different subjects. So it's just like real similar to a public school, a small public school. And then we also offer college classes, courses as well, because we do have youth until they're 25, some of them. Or they work if they've got their GED or their diploma, and they're working or learning a vocation for most of the day. They come back, have a little bit of free time, dinner, cleanup, maybe have some outside rec or go to the gym. Evenings, probably 2 or 3 days a week, they'll go participate in some curriculum of some sorts of treatment programming, a little free time, and then bed all over. So the weekends, there's a lot of visiting and kind of other activities that go on, but that's kind of the day-to-day. In the transition facility, we have 4 transition facilities, one for young women. And that is, we have one facility that has no fence. It's still a closed custody facility. That's kind of weird. But that is a lot of community interaction. People from the community will come and pick them up to take them to work with them kind of side by side in the community, or they go into town of business and get some vocational training, or we'll go out and work in the community just on like work crews and things like that. And there's a few that still need some schooling, so we do that there too. So that's a lot more freedom at some of that transition before they end up back home on parole or up to a residential program. There's a couple. I'm sure who's first. I'm Russell.
Okay.
Okay.
So is there any
Yeah, we have a large pool of volunteers that come into our programs, and a lot of religious volunteers. And any sort of religious access we need to provide. So we have a chaplain at McLaren who really organizes all the volunteers really and ensures that all those services are available for youth. Native Americans ceremonies, folks that run those programs, and yeah, we're required to provide it and lean heavily on the volunteer communities in areas where facilities are.
So as you see an increase in mental health issues throughout, kids these days, have you come across any solutions or like ways to prevent the constant increase in your talks?
Well, I can't say that we come across solutions except for the best bet would be that the right systems serve those youth. So unfortunately what happens is a lot of times because we're kind of the last stop, youth who commit crimes who have severe and persistent like mental illness or other things end up with us, even though probably they were not served or they were underserved in the mental health system. So for me, the solution is that the correct system serve kids so that they don't end up with us. That's just my thoughts. I mean, obviously, there's bigger societal issues around why more youth are having more mental health concerns. But for me, what I would prefer is that if a youth is struggling with their mental health, that they be served in the mental health system before they ever get to us. And that we not be used as a housing facility for youth who need psychiatric services. But that's just my.
I'm pretty much right there with that. And you have some other complexities, kids get into drugs just like adults get into drugs, and unfortunately there's no good way of it's really there's no good constitutionally viable way of making sure that somebody's symptoms of mental illness when they've been using meth aren't from that meth, and it takes time to figure out like was their offense really because of that. And so the way the law is written, it excludes that. So we got a couple of youth that they didn't go down the guilty except for insanity route because there was no way to really tease apart whether the role of substance use when they had their evaluation for it. So we end up with them now later, okay, still very, 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 very mentally ill, hasn't assaulted anybody in a while, so probably it was the drugs. Well, that means that they would be with us anyway. So some of it, we just don't have a good system for dealing with this sorts of kids.
I think it is about this. Hard is not easy. Somebody say they bunch of money into it. You have to have a way to work with those kids differently in those programs, because what happens, the ones that we see a lot are the kids that have trauma reactions and are mentally ill and are out of control, so to speak, in a non-secure facility. And we only have, I don't know how many psychiatric beds that we have in our state that are secure. There's not a ton of them. And so and even in those programs, so they become out of control and they hurt somebody and they end up coming to us on these charges, and it just kind of cycles out. So yeah, it's not just getting the money, but it's creating those kind of a new ways or expand the ways that we work with those and understand those kids that we can create support. That's not an easy question.
And unfortunately, as I both were seeing in the training that we were at, things that really do the things well to be able to deal with that stuff earlier really does take a lot of time, which means it takes a lot of resources. That's something that we do our best to advocate for, but there's also only so much that we can. do to advocate for that.
How's that for inspiration?
We're leaving it up to you all.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't asking for it to be easy. I just asked for thoughts. Yeah, thank you.
I think in general, if our system was serving only the youth that belonged in our system, we would have a much smaller system. There are a number of young people who, the type of crimes they commit and the severity and the how they present in the community would require our involvement. If the other systems, the education system, the DD system, the mental health system, if they were healthy and strong and supporting young people, the child welfare system, all of that, if that was all happening well, we would very much have the correct youth in our system. I feel pretty strongly that we have a lot of youth that don't belong in our system, and we don't ask for them. We don't make that decision who comes to us. That is done by the courts and largely done after nothing else can be provided to them in the community to keep the community safe. So
there's also a resource issue from county to county. So if one resource-rich county has some opportunities for youth that might not be in that county, there's no direct path from the county over to the county, have to come to the state, right? And then so there's some haves and have-nots as well.
So we serve the entire state, and so what a youth might be able to access in terms of support and services in Multnomah County versus Union County, I don't even know if you know where, I don't actually know where that is, but I know it's like way far away and they have very minimal services. Multnomah County is rich, has a ton of mental health services and drug now. I mean, they don't really, but I'm just pretending. You know, they have a lot more. And Union County might have like one therapist. And so if a youth isn't able to access the support and services that they need, then they come to us.
The state can only intervene in very, very cases. So unless there is immediate risk of harm, you know, the trauma isn't just the addition of it can also be something attachment all of those kinds of things. As children from families that don't have that is a problem. So when we try to isolate the issue, and then we look at the fascinating. We're treating the whole family. It's also balancing all those other Pennsylvania, like all that kind of stuff, but also the ability to have more creative rooms and look at those sorts of issues. Are there any examples of community successful strategy?
Oh, there's a ton. I mean, so at the county level probation where all youth start, we have beds, we have placements. When our kids are acting unsafe or not following, we have that tool. County level, they have short-term detention, but they don't have beds in places. So they do all kinds of early intervention, prevention, work to keep kids in the community. They have mentoring programs, and some of the stuff that we're building into our work now, because I feel like at our level, we've been really able to rely on, well, we can pull a kid and put them somewhere and keep the community safe. County level probation, that's not really an option unless they're absolutely needing to be removed from the community for a long period of time. So they work with kids in a very different way, and they have, you know, gang intervention programs. They have they see their kids all the time. Whereas for policy, my staff, our POs, have to see our kids once a month. County level, they see their kids every week, sometimes 3 times a week. So they're providing a whole nother level of support and services, and it's intensive. It's very intensive. All kinds of programs, mentoring. I've built programs. I worked at the county level with culturally specific services where they provide parenting and parent coaching and training to the parents, because that's often like a big piece, kind of like what you're talking about, along with mentoring, helping meet basic needs. There's a lot of work to be done, and the counties really, they're I think a real heavy lift, because they don't have the resources that we have, or they have different resources, I should say.
About 15 minutes. Last questions? What do you guys enjoy about working in the juvenile justice? And why do you stay?
I'm retired.
He's been there for like 400 years.
That's fine. Mike, just real quick, is you can't, I tell staff, anybody that works in facilities, you just have no idea of the impact you have on kids. You can't even put it into words. You can't imagine it. The most idealistic person going into this work, it's more than you would anticipate. It doesn't feel that way at all to begin with, because it's after you don't want you to, or they're trying to work you for something or whatever. You just kind of get, well, this is crazy. But for those that stick with it, keep coming back and keep coming back, see the ugliest of ugly kids and keep coming back, you have this amazing impact on young people's future and development and success. And that is, when you see that and feel that or learn that about what you do, you can't replace it with anything else. So that's my why.
And I was going to go right now. I mean, you don't get to see change like this too many places. One girl, she came in and she was like, F you to pretty much all but like 3 of us. And there were about 3 of us that she found acceptable, and that was about it. But I mean, my first conversation, I literally did her intake psych damn near jogging around the inside of the courtyard because she was pissed as hell. And you know, I was one of the couple people she would talk to. And by the time that she left, maybe 6 months later, she'd gotten over to the Young Women's Transition Program, or no, as of today, the Jackie Winters Transition Program. And literally, I went to see her the day before her PO came to pick her up. A PO that, by the way, really needs a raise, I'll tell you later. But she has this fantastic PO, and like he was coming to get her, but she asked me to come down and see her one last time, so I did. Hung out for a bit, and she calm, chill, hung out outside in this unsecured area, in a completely unsecured area, and she actually drugged me back inside with her to, so that she could actually give me a hug goodbye with staff watching, because she wanted to make sure that there were no questions. That she's like, I have to give you a hug. And like, okay. And, seeing that, or, getting to see the kid who, 9 months ago is, making suicide attempts literally every goddamn day and ripping out sutures, going for the vein, bleeding all over, absolutely smearing blood everywhere. And you then get to spend some time with them, do a little bit of special programming, night and day change. And now we're pushing to get him out to camp, which nobody would have thought would happen. And you get to see that sort of change. He hasn't made a suicide attempt in 6 months. You don't get to see that anywhere else. And it's really cool.
I'm just one of those crazy people that I like, give me a angry, cussing, gangbanger, give me, I don't know. I definitely, I like a hard kid. I always have. And I mean, I always say that like most of us get into this field for a reason. I'm not going to tell you my reason, but let's just say that I was a little angry girl at one point too. And so, it's very rewarding and for lots of different reasons. But it is, I always focus on like the baby things, but we don't get the huge payoffs for a long time. But sometimes, you know, if a kid just like asks you how you're doing, we constantly ask kids how they're doing. That moment when they get outside of themselves and ask you back, how are you? Amazing. It's amazing. Or just the little baby changes that you see in young people and are huge in our world. You get to see them incrementally making change. And you know that you're, you know, making the community safer, and you know that you're impacting youth in little ways, even if you don't like see it day to day.
Any last questions? Or do you want to?
There's one.
The question is, what is some change the policy example? Is something that they can change it?
I don't care every time. Played that one. There's a lot of things still. I think we still have a hard time I'll say in facilities, and maybe it's true, we still have a hard time seeing the kids as the problem, right? To be fixed versus a resource to be developed, right? And partner with. Because kids are really good at pushing people away and testing and all that stuff. And for a lot of folks, they still have a hard time getting to the root. And we as a system getting to the root of the issue and really addressing that and bringing that out, taking that time, especially in a correctional facility where you got 20 some youth in one unit and they're all running around. You know, I mean, it's not always crazy, but somewhat crazy. To take the time and really do that work on a consistent basis, I think we can do better. And I know that we can do way better in our system as a whole of creating equity and eliminating a lot of the systems we have that kind of perpetuate that. So those are two kind of things that jump out.
Yeah, I mean, a huge thing for me, and what I didn't realize coming into this career was going to be like my life's mission is improving how we support and serve our brown and Black youth. The juvenile justice system was not set up, the criminal justice system was not set up to actually support our brown and Black youth the way that is needed. So I came into the field just thinking I wanted to work with kids, but really what I've ended up doing my entire career is figuring out better ways to improve our system to serve our brown and Black youth. And that is a huge value of our agency. And it's not easy when systems are built to do the opposite. So have a lot of room for work, and we're doing it.
As I said, we've got a lot that we need to do in the health system to make it so that within both outside and as well as inside, because you know, there's a lot of tools that we don't have, you know, that we're trying to get there, but it's a process. And as Sandra said, getting, you know, trying to match up the youth that need a clinician that is a person of color. I can't find a Black or brown therapist anywhere. Like we literally look actively and we can't find them. We really try hard as an agency. I can't, you know, we cannot find color. We cannot find people of color to be better psychologists to come and do the work, and we need that. We need cubes that are people of color. And we can't find them. I really look hard, and you know, so that's what you want to do it because we need it.
You guys have been great.
Meeting you all.
Thank you for being here. Good to meet you. Appreciate it. Thank you for your time. It's nice to meet you. Thank you for being here. Late on a weeknight.
Anyways, can I ask you a question? So I don't, I'm gonna put some answers no, but do you have, did you get any more emails back?